In 2020, somewhere between $500,000 and $4 million in cash was allegedly stolen from a couch on President Cyril Ramaphosa's private game farm. Not from a safe, not from a bank, from furniture. 6 years later, after public prosecutor report, a SARS statement, a Reserve Bank ruling, a classified police watchdog investigation, and a constitutional court judgment, nobody in an official capacity has ever fully explained why that money was there, where it actually came from, and why it was never declared. This isn't a story about whether Ramaphosa is guilty. This is a story about what happens when every single institution built to answer that question keeps finding a reason not to. Stick around, because that pattern is the real scandal here. This is the South African Project. If you're new here, hit subscribe, and thank you for choosing this video. Here's the history under a minute, because the timeline isn't really the point. In 2020, burglars broke into Ramaphosa's Phala Phala farm in Limpopo and stole a large sum of foreign cash that was reportedly hidden inside furniture. The president never reported the theft to the police. It only became public in 2022 when a former state security head, Arthur Fraser, filed a criminal complaint accusing Ramaphosa of concealing the crime and potentially laundering money. Ramaphosa's explanation was that the cash came from a legitimate sale of buffalo to a foreign buyer. That's the whole backstory. What matters is everything that happened after, because that's where this stops being a burglary story and becomes something else entirely. Before analyzing the scandal, it's worth being honest about who it happened to, because that context changes how the rest of this reads. This isn't a politician with no financial background claiming confusion about the paperwork. Ramaphosa is a lawyer by training, one of the chief negotiators of South Africa's apartheid constitution, a former union leader who built one of the country's largest labor movement, and later one of South Africa's wealthiest businessmen. That matters for one reason. The standard explanation offered for confusing financial situation is usually what? Inexperience. That explanation doesn't hold up cleanly here. A man with a level of exposure to disclosure laws and financial compliance is not someone who plausibly stumbles into undeclared six-figure foreign currency transactions by accident. Whatever happened at Phala Phala, he cannot simply say, "I didn't understand the rules," because it is hard to make that case. So stay with me here as we go for 5 institutions but 0 conclusions. By this point, you might be thinking, surely someone investigated this. They did. In fact, that's what makes this story unusual. This wasn't one investigation or 2. It was 5 separate investigations carried out by 5 different institutions. On paper, almost every one of them reached a conclusion. The public prosecutor examined whether President Ramaphosa had violated constitutional rules. The finding, he hadn't. Although the report did conclude that the conduct of his head of security was improper. Then came SARS. With Ramaphosa's own permission, the South African Revenue Service reviewed the tax side of the transaction. Their conclusion was straightforward. His tax affair was compliant. But there's an important distinction here. Being tax compliant is not the same as explaining where the large amount of cash came from. SARS only answered the question it was responsible for, nothing more. Next, the South African Reserve Bank examined whether the transaction breached exchange control regulations. Its conclusion, no, because the sale had never actually been completed. The Reserve Bank also made something very clear. Investigating money laundering wasn't its job. That responsibility belonged somewhere else. Then there was the IPID, the Independent Police Investigative Directorate. Instead of focusing on the money, it investigated the conduct of the members of the Presidential Protection Unit. Its findings remained classified for years. Only after sustained legal pressure were parts of the report made public in 2026. Even then, the recommendation wasn't criminal charges. It was disciplinary actions against 2 officers. Either officer ultimately lost their job. Finally, the National Prosecuting Authority in Limpopo considered considered whether anyone should face criminal prosecution. Its decision there wasn't enough to prosecute, case closed. Or was it? Because something fascinating happens when you step back and look at all those 5 investigations together. Every institution answered its own question. The public prosecutor looked at the constitutional obligations. SARS looked at the tax compliance. The Reserve Bank looked at the exchange controls. IPID examined the police conduct. Prosecutors assessed whether criminal charges could be succeeded. Each institution stayed carefully inside its legitimate mandate. Each investigation reached a conclusion. Each file was eventually closed. And yet the 2 questions that mattered the most to the public were never fully answered. Where exactly did the cash come from? And why wasn't it reported sooner? Because one institution refused to investigate, but because no single institution was responsible for answering both questions together. No secret meetings, no smoking gun. Instead, 5 different institutions, 5 different mandates, 5 technically correct investigations, each examining one small piece of the puzzle, while the complete picture remained just out of reach. And that's why years later the Phala Phala scandal still divides public opinion. Not because people disagree about what happened, because the biggest questions were never answered in one place. Which brings us to perhaps the most important question of all. Was that failure of the institution, or exactly how the system was designed to work? It's worth pausing why this particular scandal captured South Africa's attention in a way plenty of other corruption stories haven't. Part of it's pure absurdity. Cash hidden in a couch is a kind of detail that turns a policy story into something people actually repeat to each other. This happening to the most qualified, most experienced man in the room is a sharper story than it happening to someone less scrutinized. And part of it is the parliamentary theater that followed. Opposition MPs demanding answers, the president choosing to respond virtually rather than in person. Phala Phala was never a story about a burglary or even about the buffalo sales. It's a live case study of how accountability can fail a democracy without anyone technically breaking a rule. Every institution involved followed its own process correctly. Every institution also somehow managed to avoid the one question that actually mattered. And if you see a video right now on screen, click on that video. YouTube thinks that video is the perfect one to watch.